Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. If you've been following these videos the last few days, you've learned a lot about the man pictured here. He is Brevet Brigadier General Alexander Shaler, who started out his Civil War service with the 7th New York State Militia, went on to the state's 65th Infantry, onto Brigade Command, received the Medal of Honor for the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, left the Army as a Brevet Major General, and went on to become a founder of the National Rifle Association with an original goal to better the marksmanship of National Guardsmen who didn't perform all that well during the Civil War. And so there's Shaler's story in a nutshell. Along the way, I found that Shaler was quite prolific in sitting for photographs. There's a large number of them out there to be found. A good chunk of those images are located in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. In fact, if you go to the Portrait Gallery, you'll find 2 pages of results, and I've done a screen capture for you here to show you one of the full portraits of Shaler. And in fact, this is a unique image of him. You'll see he's as the major, pictured as the major of the 7th New York Infantry in 1861. He and a number of the officers and enlisted men posed for portraits while they were going from New York to Washington, that first move of the war in April 1861. And each man posed for basically 2 portraits. One of them, as you see here, on the march. He has his greatcoat on, he has a haversack, his sword is thrown jauntily over his shoulder. Many of the men had pipes either stuck in their mouths or tucked into their caps. They are quite a striking bunch. No surprise that they were known as the Silk Stocking Regiment for their elite status. So each man posed for a photograph like this, and then they posed for another portrait in more of a dress uniform, the kind of uniform that you would see them wear to some sort of an event, not on campaign. So as I scrolled through all of the images listed as Alexander Shaler, I found this photograph. And as you can see from the name above, it's described as Alexander Shaler. And at first glance, it fits the bill of being that other photograph, the dress photograph, the non-campaign image of the soldier. But as I looked closer, I took a look at that face and I thought, it doesn't really look like Shaler. Keep in mind that we're looking at images from the National Portrait Gallery. And so I did a double check and a triple check just to be sure that I was right. And sure enough, along the top, it says Alexander Shaler. So I put the 2 images side by side, and to my eye, these men look entirely different. They are not the same man. And yet it says Alexander Shaler above both of them. So as I began thinking about where have I seen this man before, it occurred to me that back in 2017 in Military Images, we did a story. In fact, the author of the story was the late Michael J. McAfee, Mike McAfee. He was a curator at West Point, a prolific collector of Union portraits, and he wrote a story for us. In fact, he was a senior editor until his passing a few years ago. He wrote a story on the 7th New York State Militia featuring original cartes de visite images of these men, those jaunty off to war poses and the dress uniforms. And I remembered this image in particular, and it occurred to me, is this possibly the same man that is in the picture? And so I lined them up side by side. And in fact, Mike McAfee's image is identified as a man named Meredith Howland. And Meredith Howland was the assistant paymaster of the regiment. And so he is an officer. He went off to Washington, D.C. in April 1861 with the rest of the 7th. And so as I stared at these images side by side, one from Mike's collection and the other from the National Portrait Gallery, identified as Alexander Shaler, I thought, well, it's a little bit of a conundrum. So what does one do about that? How might I go about trying to determine whether or not the two images are the same? And so I turned to civilwarphotosleuth.com. For those of you who are students of Civil War photography, you know that we're a bunch of folks who really like to put a name to a face. One of those is Dr. Kurt Luther at Virginia Tech. A few years back, he founded this website. It's free to the public. You just have to register. And the idea is you upload an identified image or an unidentified image. And Civil War Photo Sleuth uses face recognition technology and good old-fashioned research and community to help determine the identities of the soldiers that have lost their names over time. And so I thought, okay, these images are a candidate. So I uploaded both of them to civilwarphotosleuth.com, entered the information, hit the button, and here's what I found. Boom. The first result on the results page was Meredith Howland. So based on the strength of this ID, I came to the conclusion that there's an almost 100% chance in my mind that the two men are indeed the same. The image in the National Portrait Gallery is in fact misidentified as Alexander Shaler. It should be identified as Meredith Howland. And now let me say a word about the National Portrait Gallery. The gallery, much like the Library of Congress, Smithsonian Institution museums, and National Gallery, any of the American museums that hold images are owned by us. The American public are no different than other museums across the country. They have budget limitations. They have relatively small staffs, and they have a lot of work to do. The National Portrait Gallery in the last few years has done an amazing job of uploading so many of the Civil War portraits in their collection. And as they were entering those portraits, they were also entering data based on what they had collected over the years, those basic catalog definitions. I'm sure you could track down when they were written, but not exactly sure when they were added. And so along the way, errors are made, misidentifications are occurring, and I believe that that's what has happened here. So thanks to the work of looking at these images using good old-fashioned eyeballs and brains, you take a look at some images and you see that they're different. You run them through civilwarphotosleuth.com and you make some connections, and hopefully you can correct some wrongs in the record, the annals of Civil War portrait photography and other periods in American history. So I recommend that you check out the National Portrait Gallery's amazing collection of digitized Civil War portraits. Get familiar with the Civil War Photo Sleuth, and you can be your own photo sleuth trying to help out the Portrait Gallery, the Library of Congress, and Smithsonian Institution museums to help find images. And if you find anything that looks incorrect, you can help change the cataloging. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research.